So you've got a picture in picture.
I do. It would appear that we are live.
Hello, everybody.
I believe. So it says. So I'm going to trust that it is correct. I am going to just make sure, I'm just going to make sure that the audio input is fine and that people can actually hear us.
You have a way of knowing.
Do I have a way of knowing? I will be asking for feedback.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, people can hear us. We are on. Good. First time using YouTube Live and it's Zoom integration. But thank you very much for joining us. Joined by the wonderful Stephen Fry, just going to start with a little introduction for why we're here, and then we'll get straight into it. So welcome to Working In With Heights. It's a series all about the most important organ in your body, your brain, with donations encouraged to raise money for Mind, the mental health charity for COVID-19 support. Now, my name is Dan Murray Serter, and I'm the co-founder at brain health and mental wellness company Heights, alongside my co-founder Joel Freeman and our chief science officer, Dr. Tara Swart, that many of you tuned in last week to hear from. And we believe a healthier brain leads to a happier life. And if you're trying to stay healthy and active at home, then there's a good chance you've been working out your body in some capacity already. And while it's true that this does benefit your brain as well as your body, it's our belief that our brains need to be exercised too with their own focus. And you might be doing leg day and abs day already, but this is brain day. Sometime you can schedule in and dedicate to your brain each week to understand and learn about how you work from a variety of leading voices. And unlike our bodies, our brains are just not something we can see. So ironically, out of sight and out of mind. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way. I suffered from acute insomnia and anxiety, trying to find a path back to a healthy baseline. And after a lot of research, I found out that I'd been spending all my time trying to cure my mind as opposed to my brain. And in the end, it was meeting a nutritionist and a dietitian who explained that they weren't strictly the same thing, and that the well-researched but lesser known part of the puzzle was nutrition. And I was recommended some dietary natural supplements that within 2 weeks took me back to a healthy baseline, sleeping through the night and feeling calm again, and all because I got the right nutrition for my brain. Now, we all know it to be true that nutrition greatly impacts our physical health, so it's no surprise that the same is true about our mental health. And we're very lucky to have some wonderful customers who believe in our mission, which is how we've been able to put on this wonderful series full of such incredible thinkers. And we hope throughout the course of the series, you'll consider putting your brain first too. So on to tonight's work-in. Firstly, according to neuroscience, you can't concentrate, well, we, any of us can't concentrate on talks for longer than 18 minutes, which is where that magic TED formula comes from. And that's why we've split up our session into 3 different topics and indeed 3 different work-ins. So you can learn bite-sized information about a variety of ideas every week to keep your attention strong. You're invited to do a live Q&A, which our wonderful community manager, Emma, is making sure to feed into me so we can ask them throughout our conversation. So please do pipe up. And just so you know, there's a saying in neuroscience that if you read or watch something, you learn it once. And if you share it, you learn it twice. So we do encourage you to share on social with @YourHeights and @Stephen Fry on Twitter and @Stephen Fry actually on Instagram. So that's all from me. It's time to introduce today's guest, Mr. Stephen Fry. So Stephen, welcome to Working In. How are you feeling today?
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here.
And how are you?
I'm pretty well, thanks. I'm in every sense. It's a cheap cliche, but I mustn't grumble is used all the time. But I don't think it's ever been truer that one mustn't grumble, because my blessings are numerous and profound, and I should be aware of them. I only have to think of how some people must be facing this crisis to realize how lucky I am to be with the person I love, and to be in a good condition, and to have fresh air and the ability to walk in the countryside and all of that. So yes, I'm very fortunate.
And the ability to be on Zoom and live YouTube streams all at the same time, modern day.
Yes, I'm not so sure that that's a pleasure, but it's certainly a necessity, it seems.
So in today's Cranium Gymnasium, we're looking to cover intelligence, mental health, and the sinful brain. So should we start from the top and get stuck into intelligence?
Yeah.
Okay, so the definition of intelligence is the ability to acquire, understand, and use knowledge. Now, given that you're broadly considered to be one of the most intelligent men in the country, how do you think you fare with that definition?
Well, I'm going to have to query the definition. It's a definition, the ability to. I think a lot of people have the ability to. The question is whether there's the will and the energy to do it, the drive to do it, the concentration to do it. Sometimes I wonder really if intelligence isn't a bit like what Sherlock Holmes said about genius, an infinite capacity for taking pains. It's the effort of it. I often feel I've just sort of spunked my intelligence up against the wall to some extent. I think I am quite gifted, in terms of the important useful attributes that are subsets of intelligence. Memory, key, absolutely key to that, because I have a good memory, and really pattern recognition, isn't it? And the ability to see things inside other things, which is why language is always such a clue as to the real meaning of words, because you can give a dictionary definition, but it's the derivation, intellegere, to read into, is what intelligence, intellect means, and you read into things. So there's a poetic intelligence which reads the history of human desire in the fall of an acorn from a tree, or the brush of a wing of a butterfly. That's seeing into things. So the great thing about the language, the word intelligence, is it doesn't need division into cognitive, mathematical, intellectual intelligence, which is a bit of a tautology. It's all about that seeing into, I think. And to see into, you've got to look into. So first of all, you need the curiosity, the drive, because the difference between seeing and looking is like hearing and listening, isn't it? You can see all kinds of things, but you don't notice them, but you've also got to move your head towards them. You've got to be interested. And I think one of the tragedies of much of life is how many of us are really all as intelligent as each other, but some people just don't have the drive to find out. They've either been made afraid by education that has made them feel left out, that somehow certain words, phrases, references, they've decided they can't catch up with. Just as I feel like that, a bit like that with music. I can pick out single notes with my fingers on the piano and build them into a chord, but I can't sight read. And I decided, 40 years ago that it was too late, which is nonsense. It's never too late, but you make that decision. So a lot of it is to do with will, I think, Daniel. Would you agree with that?
I think that I think you're certainly right in terms of the intention and the desire needs to be there. But I think a lot of what you just said was also true in circumstance and upbringing. There's that there is definitely an interesting class divide when it comes to intelligence, which is essentially a lottery of where you can be born. And that doesn't take away obviously anyone's natural drive to change those things, but I guess it can also be considered, at least as part of the debate.
Yes, I mean that's a very, very, very huge subject, isn't it? I mean, I think the actual intelligence and capacity and capability of all humans is more or less the same, within an ambit of, in as much as we can all, without a deficit at birth or a trauma, we can all walk and we can all run, but obviously some people are going to be able to run faster than others. And that can be to do with training, and it can be to do with just innate, physical ability that they've somehow been born with. And the same slightly with the mind, isn't it? I mean, given you don't have a deficit of cognition in terms of speech and understanding and so on, everybody is within the same band, but there'll always be some people who are a bit faster and some people who are a bit slower. On top of that, as you say, there is upbringing. There's how much your parents read and how much they read to you, and all kinds of things which are terrifying. But again, they tend they tend to reinforce this idea that things are too late, because you'll read, oh, having your mother read to you when you were 3 is a sign that you are likely to get a bit more A's at A level than if she didn't. Well, if your mother didn't read to you and you come across this statistic, you're going to go, oh, well, what's the point then? I give up. And that's nonsense, because none of these things is defining. One of the most important things, I think, that we have to address, because it's also relevant to this crisis, is the fact, again, oddly enough, that Sherlock Holmes pointed out in the very second Sherlock Holmes story, which is called The Sign of Four. He says to Watson at one point, it's not relevant to the story, he just makes the observation that while you cannot predict what a single person will do, you can never predict what a single person can do, you can predict with an astonishing amount of precision what an average number of people will do. And that's more shocking, really, than most people would perhaps think. It's the basis of all behavioral science. And I think in this crisis, we're all aware that there are virologists and epidemiologists who have the ear of government. And when government says we're following the science, we all think, oh, well, they're following virologists and epidemiologists. But sitting in on those SAGE meetings and COBRA meetings and subcommittees are dozens of behavioral scientists who can model our behavior in the same way as an epidemiologist models the course of the disease, you know, with these famous peaks and so on. And that's, of course, why Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer, why they said we didn't bring in the lockdown until the date we did, because we wanted the peak to coincide with the population still putting up with it, because they're aware that we will stop putting up with it and that we'll become more and more lax about it, more cross about it, more upset, more unhappy, and that will affect our health, in our mental health and our physical health. And you can't say that of any individual, but you can say it of the average of humanity. And it's the same with, so when you talk about this is what makes people intelligent, but you, this person listening, you're different. Every one of us is an individual, even though as an average, we can be plotted and predicted. And that's a strange paradox about human behavior, but I think a very important one to bear in mind, whether you're talking about something as loaded as intelligence or something as urgent as this particular crisis.
And it's interesting because the example you give kind of plays nicely into EQ, emotional intelligence, realistically. Because that's part of what that is modeling, right? Which is our capacity for the patience and understanding as a society to do these things.
Yes, I suppose it is. I mean, these things leach into other words like wisdom. We're fully aware of the difference between intelligence and wisdom, though it's quite hard to pin down. At a sentimental level, one can say that you can go into a developing country and see an old person who may not be able to read or write and has no knowledge of the abstract intellectual things that make an intellectual, but you can watch them behave and say this person has extraordinary wisdom. And I sometimes wonder what the point of intelligence is when wisdom is so much more handier thing. The best definition of wisdom I ever came across was a man called Michael Ramsey, who was the younger brother of one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century called
Gordon Ramsay.
No, called Frank Ramsey, who by coincidence there happens to be an article about in the New Yorker at the moment. But anyway, Frank Ramsey died at the age of 26 and was really quite an extraordinary genius. But his brother Michael, there's my computer going, sorry about that. His brother Michael became Archbishop of Canterbury, and he had huge white eyebrows. And when I was a boy in the 60s, I just saw him being interviewed by someone like Malcolm Muggeridge. And they said, Your Grace, you are accounted by all who know you to be a very wise man. And to look at you, one can say that you look wise. And Michael Ramsey said, Am I wise? I wonder if I'm wise. Am I wise? And the interviewer said, Well, what would Your Grace say is a definition of wisdom? He said, Oh, wisdom. I think wisdom is the ability to cope. And that's always stayed with me. because what, we're all aware of the chess genius, the math genius, the musical genius who can't sit the right way on the lavatory, who's just completely incapable of either socializing or connecting with other people or with ideas or with them, anything that we might consider deep and fulfilling in life, and yet they are clearly a genius. And we look at people who have wisdom, like I suppose it's Mrs. Wilcox in Howard Zinn, sort of characters like that who and in fact, Mrs. Ramsay, talking of Ramsay's Into the Lighthouse, the Virginia Woolf novel, how peculiar. There seems to be a Ramsay Day. Anyway, sorry, I'm beginning to babble, but I suppose what I'm talking about is, not being sure, not knowing, is the greatest privilege of intelligence, because if you're intelligent, you have the confidence to know the limits of your knowledge and don't have to prove to anyone else, I know this, I know that. You're actually much happier to say, I don't know this. I am completely ignorant about this branch of philosophy or this branch of science and mathematics. I only vaguely know it as an idea. I'd love to know more about it. And you define yourself by the limits of your knowledge, and you're happy to do so. But people who are less sure are less likely, and that leads one to things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is much talked about these days. The fact that the least competent have the highest view of their own competence, naming no trumps, and it's all very well to be this kind of this unsure sort of intellectual who says, well, we don't know, do we? And look at Bernard Russell and all these great heroes and how they don't have any answers. And it's tweedy and it's comforting, but unfortunately we live at a time, even this particular crisis aside, when people want answers. And so they veer between two extremes, between absolute materialism in science and absolute immaterialism and spirituality and religion. And it's quite difficult to be in the middle, It's like in the same way that the hard left is trying to make the word centrist politically an insult, which I always think is preposterous. It's that dog is never going to hunt, that flag is never going to fly, because being centrist is obviously a very sensible position most of the time. But being centrist in the worlds of materialism, of science, and spirituality, of religion, is a tricky one. You can sometimes think you're falling between two stools, that you don't really have a grip. It's so easy to have a grip on things if you're entirely material and if you're entirely spiritual, because they seem to provide answers. And if your whole being is sort of absorbed in not having answers and enjoying that, you can seem like a useless excrescence, an ivory tower muser who has no particular use in the world. We have use for hard science, and we have use to, for people to pray or give us mindfulness lessons and spirituality and yoga and other such things. But people in between who are a bit doubtful about all that spirituality, and who feel that the splendor of science, which is magnificent, and we wouldn't for a minute want to dispute, isn't everything. We have a sort of Wittgenstein view that there is something else, another realm, if you want to call it that, which science as yet seems unable to say anything useful about. And only art seems to be able to say useful things. But that again seems, in times of urgency, to be a dilettante, or at least a luxury. I don't believe it is one, but am I answering your question? I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You
are never. And I know I can certainly see the comments. No one does think that. I guess I just wanted to touch on, before we go to the questions that I'm being fed through. You raise a really good and interesting point on knowledge, on absolutes, on wisdom, and I suppose those things really cover human intelligence. But when we're creating a world with artificial intelligence, it's very interesting to think about the makeup of where the insights come from in order to design the future within artificial intelligence, because there's a lot of finites there rather than a lot of curiosity. So to the definitions you were giving, potentially a lot of knowledge over wisdom. And I'd love to get some of your thoughts on that transition.
Well, I mean, that is a truly perplexing and fascinating issue, isn't it? Because if artificial intelligence is able to solve problems, including human problems and problems that we would regard as exclusively previously the domain of softer sciences like psychology and sociology and indeed politics, and if it was able to come up with answers that satisfied all kinds of problems, there we would be hard put to claim an exceptionalism to those parts of our brain that are other, that are soft and artistic and creative and loving and emotional, and so we again return to those wonderful science fiction writers who've been there before us, whether in popular culture, like whether it's Data and Spock in Star Trek, or whether it's Hal in 2001. The misery of the robot that wants to be human, and the envy of the human that wants to be a robot. These are both very strong and very ancient. I mean, they predate the idea of robotics and androids and artificial intelligence, really. They're there in myth. Would we, I mean, if there was a button and we could press it and we would lose everything in our makeup that made us unhappy and miserable and yearning and empty and dissatisfied with ourselves and ashamed and guilty and all the negative human feelings, if we could press that button, because they would be replaced by a supreme ability to solve problems and to make money and to achieve things and to do well, but without any of the drawbacks, would we press it? And it's almost a psychopathy test, that button, isn't it? Because most of us feel, for no reason that can be easily expressed, that we want to be weak and fuzzy at the edges and slightly fluffy and a little bit of a faltering human, and we don't want to be perfect. Of course, you can't by definition be perfect, because that's always the thing that's out of reach. It means finished.
That's
really
not what people on YouTube are saying in the comments, I'm afraid.
Oh, really? What are they saying?
No, there's a lot of people saying that they think you're definitely as close to perfect as. I am gonna go to a couple of the questions though, just so people are aware that they're definitely going to get them answered. I guess on the basis of we've got a lot to cover. If you can make them as snappy as possible. So, no, only so that we can get through a few, because there's just so many.
Aware of how verbose I am.
I'll start you off with a super easy one that's mostly a yes no with some context, which is, does Stephen Fry meditate?
Do you know, I did for a while. I was interviewed by Sam Harris on his Waking Up podcast.
I just did a Sam Harris right before our interview to get me in the zone.
Oh, did you? Yeah. And then he changed his name to Making Sense, I think. But it's the same idea. And I sort of promised him I'd have a go. And so I downloaded his app. And I found it really pleasant. And I just sort of dropped out of it. I can't pretend that there was some empirical achievement that but I loved the experience of it, because I was surprised by how the mind could simultaneously be very, very focused and deeply relaxed. And they've always seemed to me to be opposites in the past, and meditation appears to bring them together. But I can't claim that empirically it made me feel that I thought better, faster. It was just an interesting experience, a bit like taking a drug, but which didn't have a big crashing K-hole at the end of it, if you know what I mean. So in that sense, it was very pleasing. And it probably is like taking a drug, because it presumably does help release some of one's own opiates, as it were,
Absolutely. Well, then that is you tried, but not currently, I guess.
I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from Julie, who says, can being intelligent be a drawback in keeping a healthy mind? Can you overthink, do you think?
Yes, I'm sure that's probably true. And I think you have to have, if you want to divide it into these kind of different types, you have to have the emotional and intelligence to realize that problem-solving intelligence, quickness of mind, and the ability to, whether it's play chess and solve puzzles and absorb abstract ideas and remember them and repeat them elegantly and be in charge of language. And that sort of intelligence is not going to help you with problems of mood and love and emotion and feeling and betrayal and all the things, all the storms in the mind that can drive one to intense feelings of misery, right to the very brink where you really wish not to live anymore. That you cannot solve them with the same intelligence that you can solve a crossword puzzle or a chess problem. And to think that you can, to say, all right, now, come on, I've got this problem. There must be an A and a B and a therefore and a syllogism and a sort of series of steps in logic that can bring you to the end. Because I may be proved wrong, but I just don't think that that's the right. It's like trying to tune a piano with a lawnmower. It's just the wrong tool for the wrong job. So I think the most important thing is to have enough emotional intelligence to let go of your problem solving cognitive intelligence and to try and use your sense of what's right and what's working, and also to let down your defenses, your pride, because the problem with intelligence is it can lead to a very strong sort of intellectual pride, which can't accept that you need to ask for help.
I think that's often just called being a man asking for directions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to do a last question on intelligence, and then we'll move on to our next topic. But Karma, amazing name for this question. How do you think intelligence is limited by poor mental health state or poor sleep?
Your karma just ran over my dogma, we used to say in the 60s. That's a really good question. I suspect that the answer is greatly. Almost every day, certainly until this crisis, there seemed to be a new article in a newspaper or a journal linking sleep and poverty of sleep with all kinds of problems, whether it's problems, heart problems, atrial fibrillation, whether it's buildup of plaque in the brain that leads to dementia, and whether it's to ability to concentrate during the course of the day. In fact, I was reading so many articles about how important sleep was. I was losing sleep over how much sleep I wasn't getting, and I was, it was
that's
really.
what happened to me with the
It does.
You get so anxious about going to
those
sleep.
Spirals.
Yeah,
absolutely right. And then you do all the wrong things, like thinking, well, maybe a stiff whiskey before I go to bed will help. And of course, it's the last thing that can possibly help with sleep. Yes, I have a strong feeling that sleep has a great deal to do with it. And not just the actual effect of sleep, but if you are able to sleep, if sleep is coming easily to you, it's a sign that other things are going right in your life that I think will help with your intelligence and with your happiness, which is more important. And so it's a kind of a virtuous circle you have to get into. You have to live during the day in such a way that sleep becomes a natural and easy thing. But I'm really worried when people put numbers on things like that. I know that's useful, and it's just the way we measure everything. There's a metric for everything. But if people start to feel bad because they've only had 6 hours sleep and they've read that it should be 6.5, 7, or no, someone else said 7.5, and they'll start punishing themselves or feeling that they've failed, or they'll believe there's a sleep bank and that they now owe, after a few months, they owe 1,000 hours to their sleep bank, and how will they ever get that back? And that's a mad way to think, or at least it can lead to, it's a deranged, it's wrong thinking. I think you have to, one of the most important things in mental health in all areas, I think, is to forgive yourself, to learn. It's to forgive others, certainly, but to forgive yourself primarily for mistakes, in the same way as it is with going on a diet or anything. Yes, you will fall off the wagon, you will make a mistake, but if you believe that shuts out any chance of success, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think all these things are clearly important, and they are important to intelligence, but I think it's a huge mistake to get absolutely obsessed by them.
Well, I think this is the perfect segue into our next session, which is all about mental health. So,
right.
obviously you are globally well recognized as one of the leading activists.
Right.
Yeah, one of the leading mad people. Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. No, but you know, one of the first people to come out and talk openly about it, being honest about it, pioneering the comfort, which, you know, is certainly accelerated in the last few years. But you know, the comfort of being able to talk about it and talking about mental health like physical health. Now, I would love to know if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief overview of your own experiences with your own mental health and how that's developed over the course of your life. So, you know, is it like you feel more stable, you know, in the last few years than you used to, or is it not a continuum like that? If you could give us your life story.
Yes. Well, I mean, from almost the earliest time that my parents can remember, I was a hyperactive child, and I think had the condition been as readily diagnosed as it is now, I would have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and probably given Ritalin or something similar. And as it was, through school, by the time I got to 13 or 14, as I think is quite common when puberty starts to kick in a big way, I became pretty much unmanageable and was expelled from schools. But in the period before being expelled, my parents had sent me to a psychiatrist, and he was a classic Harley Street thing with a huge Mont Blanc pen about that big, and you know, and a three-piece suit and a gold chain. In fact, he was a Tory MP. He was a health minister as well as a psychiatrist. Weird, but I only found out years later that he wrote on a piece of paper, which he sent to my parents and to my housemaster at school, bipolar ? Which was a very interesting diagnosis in those days. In those days, bipolar wasn't used very often. Most people said manic depression in there. But so he saw that there was something in my behavior, because talking to me, he realized that I not only was very disruptive and manic in the schoolroom, but also that I had periods of extreme distress and closed down and couldn't be addressed or talked to. And then, it all went so bad in so many schools that I ended up in prison. I mean, because I had a hint of kleptomania, which is not a diagnosed condition, but I made free with credit cards for a while. Anyway, I ended up in prison, and that was you know, I can laugh about it now, but obviously it was pretty tough when I was 17, 18, and got away with two years probation, and then settled down to work really, really hard to get into university, which I was desperate to do because I'd thrown away so much of my schooling. And I got into university. I got a scholarship to Cambridge, and there I met some extraordinary people and was fortunate to join the Footlights and have a career in show business. And I had discovered how to work and to focus and to concentrate, and I kind of had periods of mania. And you know, I can remember my friend Hugh telling me quite early on when we were shooting one of our first television things, that the director had come to him and said, "Is Stephen on drugs?" And in those days, I absolutely wasn't. I don't think I'd ever taken a drug in my life apart from aspirin. But Hugh just said, "No, that's the way he is." And I didn't realize it was odd. But I spoke incredibly fast and was just bounced off the walls. And it seemed to, you know, if I was unwell, it was just a mania, because the depression seemed a fair way off. But then, towards my 30s, it started to change, and like a lot of people, when you start to get a mood change and you don't know what it is, you don't know that it's an illness, you reach out for something that can alter it. So if you're feeling low, you take something that can make you feel high. In my case, cocaine in a dismally cliche showbiz way, and alcohol too. They go together easily, and one pulls you up and one down. And things, you know, came to a head in 1995 when I was in a West End play, and I was just suddenly, one Sunday, I was in a state of complete emptiness. It was as if I drained of all energy and all feeling and all hope and all possibility. And I tried in a lock-up garage to start the car and make myself go away through the exhaust fumes, but I hadn't realized that it was not the the catalytic converter was such that it would have taken a week of breathing in the fumes or something. Anyway, so I drove to Europe and ran out of a plane. There was a big scandal. And anyway, it meant that I concentrated on doctors and was given for the first time a proper diagnosis of bipolar disorder and some medication. And the medication started to work. And I started to learn about this condition, and it went and it came back, and it went and it came back, and I agreed sometime later to make a film about, you know, The Secret Life of the Manic-Depressive, it was called, in order to find out more about it and to share what I'd learned, because it struck me that it was a big subject, and that it had been so taboo. And that it rather in the same way that it's easy for someone in show business, or it was easy for someone in show business, to come out as gay in the 80s, as I did, much easier than somebody who was, I don't know, say a teacher or a librarian or a spot welder or whatever, or a forklift truck driver. Much harder for them. But actors, no one's surprised. Similarly, no one's surprised that actors are a bit, loopy in the mind as well. And we can get away with it. It's one of the privileges of the artistic license, I suppose you might say. So it struck me as being a kind of necessary thing to talk about, and it did have a remarkable effect, actually. I mean, just simply, doctors would tell me that then kind of people would come to them presenting with depression, and the doctors often just gave them an antidepressive without even asking them if they ever had an up cycle, which is what bipolar is, the two poles, the up and the down. Anyway, so that's sort of roughly my history, and I stayed on medication for some time, and then I went off it about 4 years ago, because I don't know, as I got married, I was taking more exercise and looking after myself, and I won't claim that these are solutions. If they were, it would be the easiest illness in the world to cure, and it isn't, and there is no cure as such. There's just ways of managing it. For me, this has helped enormously, but I still have the medicine on standby should I need it, and occasionally I go off into kind of manic cycles where I get a bit kind of weird and I have to take these things that bring me down a bit, and I do have times when I'm not feeling happy, but generally speaking, I'm in a lucky cycle at the moment, and I drink almost nothing now. I mean, very rarely drink, and that helps too, I think. I'm pretty sure. But again,
you say you don't think those things, necessarily, they're not the cures, obviously, because there is no cure-all. But in a very similar way that, you can't just have a healthy body. You can try your best, and you can have great wellness principles to be fit and look after your health span and lifespan for your body, but it won't stop you getting cancer. That's just bad luck. That's what can happen. Same thing that I think with mental health. And when I hear you say, that you took up exercise, you stopped drinking alcohol, I know you became a vegetarian. It's not necessarily that diet that I'm specifically saying, but just the conscious awareness to make those changes. They, I'm sure it's no surprise that they help to contribute, like say, not a cure.
If you don't care about yourself, Daniel, if you've given up on yourself or you hate yourself, then you naturally let your body slide as well as your mind. And it is easier to deal with the body. If you start caring about yourself, then it's much easier to say, okay, I'm going to stop poisoning my liver with, all that vodka. I'm going to stop poisoning my nose and brain with all that cocaine. I'm going to walk my body a bit more. I'm going to reward it a bit because I like myself a bit more. That's much easier to do than to turn inwards in your mind and reward your mind, as it were. So that's why, yes. I mean, the only reason I'm saying I'm not saying this is a cure, because I think all psychiatrists would say it's really good idea for people with a mental illness to try and look after their bodies as much as they can, for all the reasons I've just mentioned. But I'm always very, very leery about saying this is a cure, because for some people have the disease so much more seriously than I do, and I wouldn't want likely to suggest that all you have to do is do what I do and go for a walk every day and it'll be fine, because that's going back to the old days of people saying, why don't you just walk it off, as if it isn't a real illness, and it is a real illness. illness.
And especially insensitive in quarantine to be giving
Yes.
advice.
Well, yes. And the thing I always want to say is that there are two sort of opposite points of view you have to have about a mental illness like bipolar disorder. And one is you must never underestimate its seriousness. It has what doctors call a high morbidity. In other words, it can lead to serious ill health and death. And we all know the suicide figures are very alarming in this country and around the world. So it's not something to take lightly. It can affect, it can cause people to spin out of their family and their work and go right down onto street level where they become, really at the very, very end of everything that's hopeful in life. So you mustn't forget that that's a truth about mental illness. On the other hand, you must also bear in mind that some of the most remarkable and fulfilled and inspiring people who've ever lived have had mental illness. So those two things are true. So, my great hero is Kay Redfield Jameson, who's this extraordinary American woman who wrote the book An Unquiet Mind, who was extremely bipolar and is, bipolar 1. She had a youth of, but she's the professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, which is the leading medical hospital in America, and as well as a professor of comparative literature at St Andrews University in Scotland. She has the most compendious mind, and she's written Touched by Fire, which is a book about some of the people who had mania and how they turned it to creative uses, and yet she also has the highest level of lithium as a dose every day. So she has to have her kidneys checked so they don't explode, because it's almost toxic levels she has to have to keep her being able to live any kind of normal life. So she's extremely ill, but she achieves astounding things, and so it's bearing those two things in mind is I think important. It's not a death sentence, but it is serious.
No, absolutely. I think something really helpful, and I certainly know that people would find it helpful to hear from you, is obviously so it's estimated that 1 in 4 people suffer from a mental health disorder in their time. But if you look at the other side of that figure, 3 in 4 that don't are probably going to know someone, live with someone, have someone close to them that does, and won't necessarily be able to naturally relate to the right way to deal with it, the right way to communicate with them, the right way to be helpful. So do you have any insights or experience from people in your life that have helped you? What has worked, what hasn't worked, what's felt like the right approach and what hasn't?
It's tricky because, almost by definition, if you're having a real sort of episode, you are unreasonable. So sometimes even the most delicate and tactful question can be irritating to one. But generally speaking, I think I've said it before, don't look for a reason in the sense of, are you depressed because I don't know, your bank balance is lower than you thought it would be, or because this, that, or the other. But sometimes depression isn't that simple. It's lowered down on you. It is depressed. It's pushed down onto your mind like a great force, like weather. I've said this, often. It is like the weather in as much as it's completely real, but also that it's not one's fault. One didn't create it oneself, and that it isn't permanent. That's the other important thing. But so, the best thing if you see someone's miserable and so on is not to shun them, but just to say, listen, I can't possibly understand what's going on with you, but if there's anything I can do to help, if there's anything that would be useful, let me know. If you want to be let alone, I won't be offended. If you want me to sit with you, I'll happily do that. Just let me know if you can. And that's as kind and good a thing as you can say to someone. But try not to be the doctor and says, I'll cheer them up, because you'll feel a failure for doing it. They'll feel pressure to try and be cheerful just for your sake, when in fact it's going against what the natural flow of their illness. So it's a sensitivity thing, really, and I'm sure most people are good at it.
Okay, I'm going to go to some questions, right, because we've been getting a lot. So again, if we can try and keep them concise, so we don't have to run over too much, because we will run over if that's okay with you, because it's looking like it's going to happen. But
sorry, I do go on, don't I?
I think everyone's enjoying it. So as long as you're okay with it, they'll be okay with it. So a question from Georgina, who says that she's been diagnosed with bipolar, and she wants to know how you coped with it initially and how to come to terms with it.
Well, initially, probably not very well, and as much as I knew so little about it, and I really resisted the idea of medication of any kind. I had it in my mind that any medication was a zombification, and that it was it would destroy my personality. That my illness was part of who I was, and that if any medicine intervened, they would be squashing my personality and my identity, and I became sort of slightly obsessed with that, and also I think there was an arrogance that I believed I could kick it myself, and that it was, nonsense, and that there was too much, it was too unscientific, or too, I don't know. I resisted is the answer. But once I really understood, once a wise doctor looked me in the eye and told me how dangerous it was, and how likely it was. I mean, not 100% likely, but this doctor said to me, a psychiatrist, he said, I think there's a 60% chance you won't live for the next 2 years if you don't do something about this. And I was just absolutely shocked. I still, it gives a shiver when I remember it. And he just looked at me with clear blue eyes and told me. And I said, well, he said, no, you'll take your own life. You'll take your own life, or you'll drink yourself in, or overdose in some way, either accidentally or deliberately. That's the likelihood. It's not overwhelmingly likely, but that's what I think is likely from your illness. And I needed to be told that. I needed to hear that.
Sometimes it is helpful to get metrics and numbers attributed to things.
Yes, that's a very good point, Daniel. Absolutely right. And that really did sort of pull me off the edge, as it were, and allowed me to say, yes, let's investigate a cocktail. Because I think what you'll discover, Georgina, is that it's like alcohol. You know how you can sit with someone and you both drink exactly the same. You both have, say, 3 glasses of wine together, and you might feel a bit sleepy, but the person who's drunk exactly the same amount of wine from the same bottle becomes aggressive or loud and a nuisance. They both have the same relatively simple chemical. Alcohol is relatively simple to a chemist as a substance, but with wine, it's got other things in it. Well, how much more is it therefore the case that when a doctor says we're going to try you on this drug, that it's not going to have the same effect on you as it has on someone else? And this is the problem, that a lot of people lose a bit of faith when they first have the diagnosis, because they think there'll be maybe a medical, pharmaceutical treatment that will work straight away. But what happens is it can be a 2 or 3 year, or sometimes much longer period, in which you juggle this, cocktail of pharmaceutical interventions, and maybe they won't work. They don't work for everyone, or maybe they work straight away, or maybe the side effects will depress you, because some of them have weight gain, and just as they help with your mind in one way, they pull you down in another. And you may most people would say, Georgina, and I think this is worth looking at, is that don't turn your back on drugs that the doctors recommend. Don't turn in entirely, but nor turn your back entirely on talk therapy. That most good psychotherapists and good psychiatrists would agree that a mixture of the two is better than one on its own, if you can manage it. And of course, these things might be expensive if you can't get national health cognitive behavioral therapy, say, which is a kind of talk therapy, or psychotherapy, as well as your GP or referring you to a psychiatrist. Then you've just got to bully your GP into showing how much you need it. But also reach out. I obviously say this as president of the institution, Mind, who are benefiting from your kind presence at this event, I'm happy to say. And Mind and there are other charities, of course, only too happy to try and guide you as you get used to dealing and coping with your condition. But best of luck.
I have a question that I'm scared to answer, because scared to ask, even more terrified to answer, that's for sure. But scared to ask because I know that it'll invoke an interesting debate from you. It's a fantastic question, but you'll have to be willing, because the audience is asking that we do go over the 6:30 time slot. Okay. So as long as you are comfortable knowing that this question will provoke you to answer, which is, how can philosophy help improve our mental health?
Goodness me. Well, there's a big distinction between philosophy and a philosophy, isn't there? There is philosophy, which is speculation about the mind and the brain and reality and truth and the way things are. So, you know, and philosophy as a study is divided into different mansions, different, you know, groups, as it were, different houses within the village of philosophy. Logic is an obvious one, which is almost mathematical, really. But then there's ethics, which is perhaps the most popular, because it's something we can all think about, you know, ethical quandaries and thought experiments about the right way to behave, and questioning in moral philosophy whether happiness and goodness are connected, whether virtue, you know, doing the right thing makes you happy, or whether being happy makes you do the right thing. And then there's, how do we know things? What is the basis of our understanding, and how real is reality? And is it all like the Matrix? Is you know, is it all a show, a scenario in which we are computer generated in some way in someone's screen? And the theory and grounds of knowledge, epistemology as they call it, that's the study of philosophy, and it's fascinating, it's deeply rewarding, really amazing. But then there are philosophies, and I would say that in terms of happiness and self-respect, the one that most people are looking at the moment is a very ancient one, a Hellenistic one, which is a late classical one, late Greek one, but classical Roman one, which is called Stoicism. I'm sure you've heard of it. And
I assumed that might be something that you subscribe to.
Yes, I think so. I mean, people often use the word stoical to mean phlegmatic and not emotional, and unbattered by fate and so on. And to a certain extent, Stoicism suggests that. But it's a, if you were to read Marcus Aurelius, who's one of
it's just phenomenal meditations.
His meditations, exactly. He was a remarkable figure because he was the emperor of Rome, and you know, you think of most Roman emperors as being extraordinarily decadent, ghastly figures like Tiberius and Nero and Elagabalus and people like that. But he was a truly extraordinary man, and he wrote these meditations, and they're well worth looking at. And there are apps, some of them free, which allow you to look at a different meditation every day. And in that sense, it's a bit like being a Jesuit reading St. Ignatius, I suppose. They're little spiritual exercises. Mostly they teach you the primary lesson of Stoicism. It's a bit naughty to try and reduce it to one pill that you can take, but the primary lesson, which has, you know, many ramifications, is learning not to worry about things over which you have no control. And that's so obvious. You might say, well, why bother to give that the name of philosophy? And of course it's obvious, but so many things that are obvious need a little bit of extra inspection, if you like. And it's surprising how much of our unhappiness does find roots in our attempting to change things over which we can never reasonably expect to have any power. You know, other people's behavior, other people's views, other people's things that really just aren't for us to get churned up about. If we're going to get churned up, we should get churned up about how we feel about ourselves and what we've done, how we've acted and how we've behaved, and our effect on others, because that we can control. We really can. And we're such a silly species because we've got it all the wrong way around. So yes, Stoicism is quite simple, but it's a bit like saying Greek architecture is simple. It doesn't take away its grace and its monumental importance.
And can be very powerful for our control of our mental health.
Yes, I think it can. It genuinely can.
With that perfect segue into our third section. So you're talking about self-control, and you're talking about all the things that, you know, we can affect in our lives that, you know, keep us on the straight and narrow, and, you know, concentrating on our positive forces and voices. But I happen to know that you're also quite a fan of sins and what's going on in the sinful brain. So the path to temptation, the path to wrongdoing, the path to, well, according to philosophy and theology, hell. So shall we talk a little bit about the sinful brain? Can you take us through what's your favorite sin?
Favorite? Well, you say I love sins. I mean, of course, I'm frightened of them because I'm like all of us. I'm so prey to them. I think sins are destructive, but they can harm the world, but they really do harm the self more than anything else. I think, you know, an obvious example is gluttony. Gluttony is deeply pleasurable because food and drink and the physical pleasures of this world are so great, and they've never been more available. You don't even have to be a Roman emperor to enjoy great sustenance and beautiful food and wine and all the things that are around. And yet it doesn't really hurt anybody else if you're gluttonous, and yet, of course, it does. Ultimately, we'll come to that. Most of all, it hurts oneself, and gluttony is an obvious example because you just get fat and diseased and sclerotic arteries, and then you keel over or you explode like Mr. Creosote in Monty Python's Meaning of Life, you know, when you have that last wafer-thin mint. So everything that's true of the individual in sin is true of the human race as a species, which is what I find interesting. So we can be that fat person who explodes, but as a race, we are that fat person. We are a greedy race, and we have sucked almost all the juice out of the peach of a planet onto which we were born, and we are handing over a dried out husk to our children and grandchildren, or at least there's a danger of it. So as individuals, it hurts us to be greedy, to be lustful, to be proud, to be angry, because it eats into oneself, it corrodes oneself to be like that. But each one of those things as a species, when we're like that, is ghastly too. But the thing that interested me about it is that because I'm not religious, or at least as part of not being a religious person in the sense of believing in a God or adhering to a particular religious doctrine or series of doctrines, is it doesn't mean that one isn't aware of right and wrong, good and evil. And over time, people have thought about these things very hard, obviously, and different people have come up with different views as to how to behave well. And the current one in philosophy, which is called consequentialism these days, but used to be called utilitarianism, which is to say, you act such that you do the least harm to anyone around you. And the best thing, the greatest good for the greatest number. The utilitarian philosophy is that you behave, you have as much freedom as you need, and as long as your freedom doesn't impinge on the freedom of the health and happiness of others, as long as you don't cause suffering to others, you can do what you like, and so on. And everything is based on the consequences of your action. If the consequences of your action are bad, then they should be thought about. Then that's how we define them as bad. And while I think that's true, there's a more ancient kind of philosophical view, the deontic view, as it's called, which is best known through a philosopher called Kant. But actually, you don't need to be a philosopher. It's Jiminy Cricket. It's the voice in your head. It's that strange impulse, this obligation, this feeling when you're falling asleep at night. I was such an asshole last night. Why did I do that? I hate myself. I can be better. Please let me be a better person. Not so that you're more admired. It genuinely is a feeling. And it can be that you feel there's a God watching you. When when my grandfather died, whom I adored, I thought for a couple of years afterwards that, although I didn't really believe in life after death, I thought he was watching me. So when I was alone doing something bad, stealing or masturbating, whatever it might be, that you thought was bad when you were 12, I imagined my grandfather was watching me, and it made me shrivel up with guilt. And most of us would say, yeah, that's the problem with society, the Victorian society, this patriarch looking down on you, this God with big side whiskers telling you how to behave and making us feel guilty. And that's the awfulness of the Hebraic Christian tradition of God pointing at Adam, and Adam being ashamed and covering up his nakedness. And yet, while I agree with all that, there is a part of me that just genuinely feels there is such a thing as wickedness, my greed, my selfishness, my meanness, and I would love not to have them. And you don't hear about people talking about them. So I did a podcast series called The Seven Deadly Sins, just because these days we look in every direction except inside ourselves as to what's wrong with the world. And I thought maybe it's worth looking inwards to one's own wicked, cavernous, black, dripping soul.
It is quite interesting how all of the low-hanging fruit, the thing that gives us immediate pleasure for the brain, so the stuff that we will get a reward spike for immediately, quite often is the stuff that's actually bad for us mentally and physically long term, and the stuff that's good for us physically and mentally long term is the stuff you don't necessarily enjoy quite so much in the moment. And there's a kind of cruelty to that reality, and
Absolutely.
you can see why people gravitate towards sins even though they're not good for you, because in the short term they're fun.
It leads back to intelligence, actually, because it's a mistake of evolution, if you like. We made this extraordinary evolutionary leap that is sometimes called the cognitive revolution, where within a surprisingly short and recent time, we developed language, and we refined our tool-making skills as a result of language, and our social skills are banding together to such a sophisticated degree that we suddenly had a calorific intake which was far in excess of any other living thing, that the mixture of language, the ability therefore to plan, to speak of the future, to plant, the agricultural revolution that came, the taming of animals, the cooperation with other human beings, all this led to the ability not to scrabble every second of the day to get one's calories to be alive, as all other animals seem to do. If you look at animals in the wild, it's constant stress trying to eat enough and to avoid being eaten, and just to eat enough to be able to mate and pass on your genes. And because we developed this intelligence, the thing we started talking about, we were able to overcome those problems. But unfortunately, physically, our hormonal, our endocrine system, our reward and punishment system, didn't catch up with it. So it still told us, have more of that sugar, because it thought that we were still in the jungle, where a small piece of sugar could keep one in calorific happiness for a couple of days. Instead, we gorged it all in a half an hour, and then an hour later, more. And our brain said, yes, more. And so the very intelligence that has allowed us to rise, if rise we have, it has also short-circuited or leapfrogged our physical evolution, so that it means we are doomed to be destructive to ourselves, because we still have these impulses to feed and to enrich ourselves.
Which quite nicely brings us back to the first part where we were actually talking about intelligence, and the
That's
Flynn
right.
effect.
Exactly, it does. Yeah.
You're familiar with the Flynn effect?
Oh no.
So basically, IQ just rising and rising and rising consistently, but it's plateaued now. So there's some sort of suggestion that it's the end of IQ growing, and there's a very interesting correlation potentially to just our gravitation towards sins and towards like you're saying, gluttony,
Yes.
and all the others that are just becoming destructive, stopping us from fulfilling that exponential curve through intelligence.
Yes, there's a part one also that recognizes that the greed, the need to improve, to just to grow, to that sort of stretching, that is part of what makes us who we are, and that rationally we should try and get rid of all this desire, this need for calories, for riches, for admiration, for possessions, that the idea that we could be simple, some idealized medieval idea of, like William Morris at the height of the Industrial Revolution, saw the ugliness and the poverty and the misery and the slavery and the pollution of it all, and sort of romanticized and idealized the medieval. And we tend to do that to hunter-gatherers. If only we could go back to not having this awful desire to keep keep growing and getting and spending and yet I don't know, maybe we will, and maybe this crisis, of course I'm not confident or claiming any real belief in it, but I'm sure we've all thought, haven't we, that when we do stumble out into the light and that the all clear whistle has been blown, most of us would probably say, let's get it right this time. Let's some obvious things. Let's make sure our health system is never ever as underfunded again. Let's help that. Let's make sure that the status of our health workers is higher and their pay is higher, and all of that. I'm sure we'll say and we'll believe in it, and let's hope it happens. But I wonder if we'll want to address, not in an old left-right way, but in a different kind of way. We want to address the way we organize our living and our working. And if it coincides with things like artificial intelligence, which before the crisis was still in an amazing growing phase, that it's not just artificial intelligence, it's the whole tsunami that is made up of different forces, different tides coming in: nanotechnology, brain-machine interfacing, bio-augmentation, quantum computing, gene editing and genomics, and artificial intelligence, machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, all these different, all coming together. They are likely, as people have found, and it seems very probable, are likely to disrupt, to use that awful word, the way we work to such an extent that it's possible that, like Finland, we'll have to start paying people just basic incomes and not expect them to work, because there won't be enough work for people to do, because white collar work is affected by AI. We're used to blue collar work being affected by automation, by robotics in the car factories and so on. But lawyers, insurance, all these kind of areas are more and more likely to be areas in which AI has a role to play. So all of that, plus the coronavirus, is a terrific motive and reason, isn't it, to rethink society, to rethink the way we live and work and communicate. Unfortunately, the people with the most passion and energy and zest are the greediest corporate people, who will want immediately to piss in every corner to mark out their territory and to make sure that nothing changes and that the money comes into their coffers the way it always has, and that we're kept down. I know I'm very lucky and I'm not a wage slave, but you know what I mean. So some form of coming together of people who are not going to just wave the same old placards of political left and right, but to find a new way which isn't too hippie and silly and unrealistic, but is twinned with science and spirituality, if you want to call it that, or at least a new way of thinking about human happiness. And if they can all come together, and then maybe this crisis won't have been in vain. But it's a big if.
It is a big if. I'm going to go to some questions, Stephen, because they're coming in thick and fast, and I want to make sure we abide by our rule of snappy answers. And
yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's all good, but we'll get some.
Like
and then
do you like my microphone, by the way?
It's lovely. I thought that was your dog.
Lovely. Yes.
So Marcus says, when locked down, how do we keep self-control without distractions of, inverted commas, life?
Well, I can't give you an answer, and anybody who says they have the answer is either a fool or a liar. I'm pretty sure of that, because we're all different, and
or a philosopher.
It isn't, or a philosopher. Well, even they wouldn't dare say this is how you do it. Firstly, repeat what I said a bit earlier, is forgive yourself. Don't expect yourself to achieve and to mark out, or don't compare yourself to liars showing off on social media the perfection of their life and the jolliness of their families and the marvelous, because everybody is different, and it's perfectly okay to be grumpy for a whole day or a whole week, and it's perfectly okay not to have hoovered your carpet or done proper things with your washing, and all of that. And similarly with your work and your mind, you can be unshaved and you can slob around, or you can decide one day I'm going to make a list, and some people respond better to that. I'm going to say this, I'm going to take this long to brush my teeth and shave. I'm going to take this long to do laundry. I'm going to cut out this or introduce that. Personally, I'm driven to distraction every day by this kind of thing. I mean, not this is a charming thing at the end of the day, but the number of requests to join conferences of one kind, video conferences, Zooms and FaceTimes and Skypes and whatever, none of which achieve anything. I mean, I'm firmly convinced that writing and texting, email is the best way of expressing who one is. Most of us have, when it comes to decision making by Zoom, Jesus, I just find it awful. But that's maybe just me. So there is no answer, is the answer. And don't feel that there should be one. Don't judge yourself because you haven't got an answer. Be okay about it.
We have a fantastic question from Dale, which is, would you say there's a correlation between intelligence and atheism? Because the more educated mind will question in a logical, scientific fashion.
Oh, no. Well, no, I wouldn't go that far.
It's a good question, but
it is a good question. And obviously there have been some brilliant minds that have been very religious. You can't deny it. And it's certainly true that most people at this part of our history who are cosmologists and scientists, if they do perhaps believe in a divine being, it's certainly not the one that has been handed down from religion. And very few intelligent people believe in the superstitious element of religion. There's either the miracles or the laws of eating or whatever. I mean, there's some very intelligent Orthodox Jews, but they will always tell you that they do it for reasons of self-discipline. It's not because they really believe God is going to judge them because they've eaten seafood or pork. It's more because they think it connects them to their ancestors, and it also just gives them a structure, and that's fine. But certainly asking questions is important. I would say there's a correlation between intelligence and a repudiation of the evangelical wing of religion. The desire to tell others what to believe, the pointing of the finger and the screaming of damnation and hellfire, the kind of American televangelism, that it's impossible to be intelligent and to be a part of that, I would say.
Okay, I've got my penultimate question, and I'm going to save the last question right for the end to make sure people are listening. So the penultimate question is, do you think the thing that happened with calorific intake is now happening with intake of information? Okay, there's just too much of it being consumed too quickly.
That is a really good point. I wonder about that. Yes, I think of that little dog K9 in that, what's it called, K9? What's that film? Anyway, whatever it was, a little robotic dog going, feed me, tell me, data. I need input. Yes, I think there is, there's a really good point to be made there, isn't there? That information in and of itself for an individual human is not the end goal. It's very hard to say when you draw the line. I now know enough would be a peculiar thing for anyone to say. But yeah, I do wonder about that, because on the one hand, machines, AI, is all about data. Data is its petrol. It's what drives it. It lives off it. It thrives off and it's never been more available. But for human beings, information in the information society, it certainly isn't. You don't get happier the more you know. There's a very credible way of saying you get unhappier the more you know, and that if there could be a human being or a machine in a sort of Douglas Adams science fiction, a machine that knew everything would probably be utterly miserable. The most miserable machine you'd ever had, because it just knew everything. Wouldn't that be awful? So yeah.
I've got, basically the same questions come up many, many times. So I'm going to save that one for the end. And I've got a very snappy one for you, which I think is just funny. And we'll see if you know your science experiments, which is from Camilla, which says, Stephen, would you eat one marshmallow now or wait for two later?
That is a great experiment, isn't it? I would eat one now, I suspect. Well, certainly when I was a child, I would eat one now. It's a famous experiment. You can see it online with these little children. It's so touching.
It's very fun.
I think maybe it is a sign of getting older, is that you are more likely to have the two later. On the other hand, I'm the opposite with unpleasant things. And I think that's an interesting thing. I do the washing up. I do boring admin jobs incredibly quickly to get them out of the way. So that's the sort of inverse thing, isn't it? Whereas I know people who just can't get round to the unpleasant jobs. I hate them so much. And I always say I work a lot because I'm lazy. And so I want to get it out of the way so I don't have it anymore. Anyway. That's a good question.
Okay, I'm saving the recurring one for last. Before we do that, I just want to wrap up. So I want to obviously thank you so much for all your time and attention this evening. There's hundreds more questions, but we're definitely going to make sure that we make it out for our NHS clap as promised. Yes. We'll be following up for our audience tomorrow with an email covering all the key takeaways from Stephen and another opportunity to donate to Mind. It's definitely possible that email might hit your promotions folder, so please do look out for it, mark it as safe, and just go from there. Now, next week, we did have Jay Shetty, but he's had to reschedule for a few weeks' time because he's had a burst water pipe in his house. He's having to move, which is not ideal in a pandemic. But our guest list doesn't disappoint, and we've got many amazing people. So instead, we've got author, TED speaker, and global grandmaster of memory, Ed Cook, who's been on the Tim Ferriss show twice, possibly because Tim forgot about it the first time round, I like to believe. So obviously, Stephen, you have a stellar memory yourself, as you said. But, I think there is arguably someone better, and that is a grandmaster of memory. He'll be here sharing 3 separate work-ins all geared towards helping you learn how to improve your memory with practical, real exercises that you can put into action instantly, same time next week. And just to finish up, another little nudge that if you read or watch something, you learn it once, but when you share it, you learn it twice, cementing and building those new neural pathways we all love so much. So please do go on social and share something that you learned or enjoyed from today with the hashtag working in, and we'll select someone at random and send them a free month supply of our smart supplement, of which Stephen is a customer. And I saw a few messages before saying, is Dan drinking gin? That's just a water bottle. We reuse our bottles as water bottles afterwards. I've not been drinking gin, honestly. We wish you all a lovely week ahead. It's almost time to clap for the NHS. Now, before we do that, I said there will be one final question for Stephen. So if you can see us out with this one, please, Stephen. And that is, it would be great to know how and what you are doing to keep well mentally and your daily practice during the lockdown. So what better way to see us out? Tell us through your daily practice, how you're handling it.
Well, again, I'm very fortunate because I am in the countryside here in Norfolk. And so I can go, I get up usually at about 5:30 and I go for a walk about, it's either 7 miles or 6 miles usually. It can sometimes. This morning, because it was starting to rain, it was about 4.5 miles. And I listen to audiobooks and podcasts while I walk, or sometimes I just take the thing out. And at the moment, birdsong is astounding. It's just incredible what's going on with the birds, certainly in the little lanes of Norfolk. And so I know how lucky I am to be able to take a country walk in remote little lanes where I'm unlikely to see another human being, and all I chat to are horses and the odd cow. So that's really an important part. So that by the time I get home back from the walk, it's 6:30 or 7 or whatever it is. I walk about 4 miles an hour. And then, I try to be slow about things, which I used not to be. So I clean my teeth very slowly. And then coffee, I'm allowed 2. But I sometimes have 3 cups of coffee. I mean, it sounds very anal and silly. And then, cheerio. So, thank you. Yep. Okay. It's a delivery. Putting it. Yeah, I did. Yes. Sorry, I had a delivery here. And otherwise, there's nothing regular at all. I was saying to you before we went live, it's extraordinary. I would never have guessed how, in this period of seclusion, time has gone much faster for me than it did in the normal days. And I would have expected it to be the other way around, that it would hang heavy. And maybe it hangs heavy for some people watching, and they wonder why it is it goes so quickly for me. And I can't really answer that. But I'm enjoying things that I never thought I'd enjoy, like housework and baking. And I'm a total cliche in that sense. I've made banana bread and sourdough and all of that nonsense.
I followed your lead on making banana bread for the first time.
But I would end with the most important thing, which is I don't have a system because there is no system, and it's different every day. And I wouldn't want to lay down a grid of behavior for anybody, because it wouldn't work. You'd try it and then think, this doesn't work for me. What's wrong with me? Or you might think, what's wrong with Stephen? And they'd both be, you'd both be right to do it, and that would be a mistake, because there is no system. There is none. And far from that being a frightening thing, it means you are the captain of your soul, the governor of your destiny, to misquote W.E. Henley. So there's no wrong way of going about it. And each day is a new day that you can restart and recalibrate. And you've lost nothing if you had a miserable day yesterday. You've lost nothing by it, because you might have a better one today. And I wish I could say this is what you do and follow my advice, but that sort of way of, there's no handbook. So, but be cheered by that, and I hope everybody, is getting through this as cheerfully and as they can, and finding good things, both with those they're sharing their seclusion with, or if they're on their own, finding good things about themselves.
That was a wonderful way to summarize it and to end. Thank you so much. And you say captain of our own soul. Well, let's leave with a big happy birthday to the amazing Captain Tom
Indeed,
Moore. 100 today. A lot for the whole nation to be cheerful for.
Absolutely. Well done, everybody. Lots of love.
So you can now go out and clap the NHS and all be grateful for the good fortune that we have in this country. Thank you so much for your time, Stephen.
Pleasure. Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye. Bye.